better never ends. In health, in performance, no matter your starting point, you can always strive for better. My name's Charlie Goodchild, I'm your host, and this is the Better Never Ends podcast. We've made it our mission to share with you the expertise and wisdom of role models and leading experts in their field, teaching us about how we can be better, telling stories about their journey to better, and inspiring you to discover yours. Welcome to the podcast, Peter. Am I calling you Peter or Pete today? Because I call you Pete, but I know you're officially a Peter.
I'm always Pete or Peter.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be here though, Charlie. Thank you for having me.
You're more than welcome. And I've known Pete, I'm going to call you Pete, it feels more natural
go
for me.
it, man.
I've known Pete for many years now. We practiced together at Pure Sports Medicine 5 to 6 years ago, I think it probably is now.
Yeah, time flies. It must have been about then.
Yeah, and Pete always stood out to me as a really interesting clinician, because ultimately his job title was an osteopath, but he never really looked like an osteopath. Yeah. So one of the reasons I've wanted to bring Pete on the podcast for so long is because it gives an idea of the breadth of clinical practice sometimes, and the breadth of human learning, and where we end up going with our specialisms or generalisms, maybe it's a better way of calling it. So I'm hoping Pete can come in today and give us a bit of an idea of his journey and his convoluted journey. So welcome, Pete. And
thank you.
Please, can you give maybe a slightly more detailed version of who you are and what your career so far has looked like?
Yeah, I guess when we worked together in London, I had a very strange clinic. I absolutely loved it, and I've been on one hell of a journey since then. But when we were in London together, I had a very diverse patient setting. I've been on a long clinical journey. Graduated as an osteopath in 2010. Before that, I did a sports massage diploma so I could volunteer at the local football club and sport has always been a real passion of mine. I've wanted to learn as much as I can about the human body and how performance can be enhanced from a clinical setting initially. Then I went and graduated. I was a traditional osteopath. I did a lot of manual therapy, traditional sort of manipulation, massage, and then did a master's degree in sports medicine. That really opened my eyes to being very orthopedic in my nature, and I took that and upskilled my knowledge of things with more kind of tendinopathy or paratenon sort of conditions, very diagnostic, biomedical sort of approach to things. And that led on to me working in polo. So I did 2 seasons working in polo. I volunteered like I recommend to a lot of students that want to get into sport. I volunteered at Paralympic Games, Hockey Masters, did a load of rugby sevens to some extent, and then started working in athletics. Got a job working in London with yourself. I became a running coach because I found a real fascination with running biomechanics particularly. And around that time, I have a lot of tendinopathy and bone stress injuries, which is not typical for an osteopath, to say the least. So I'd often have them on a treadmill, looking at them running and analysing their gait, retrain it and give them some strength and conditioning. But around that time, someone gave me an Explain Pain textbook, and I'm sure lots of clinicians have been on this path as well, where just a little light switch went off, and that really opened my eyes to the pain science side of things. So being an enthusiastic clinician, always looking to develop, I went down another path where I did the David Butler course, Peter O'Sullivan, and just engrossed myself in studying and reading as much as I could about pain science. And that's when you and I met, Charlie. Yep. And I'd have a very strange clinical practice, because I'd have a marathon runner with an Achilles tendinopathy on a treadmill, and then I go into the treatment room and have someone that had 2-3 years of back pain, that had seen physios, had surgery, injections, that was fundamentally scared of their body, and a lot of kinesiophobic sort of habits and things they picked up. Since then, I then got a job working for British Athletics, and I transitioned from more endurance passion to more sprinting, speed sort of performance. An opportunity arose to open my own clinic, which I opened up 3-4 years ago in Kent, called Acer House Practice, where I'm very fortunate to have built a nice environment, and a lot of clinicians and colleagues have come to work at the practice. I'm lucky to work with and still learn from every day, but I've still kept a footing in the sports world. So I go to Lee Valley regularly. I've transitioned from British Athletics to working for one of the senior coaches directly. And I guess now I have 4 main roles. One is clinical practice. I've always kept that up because I think that's incredibly important. And I love the diversity of the clinical practice. I also work in elite sport, track and field, a lot of footballers and that sort of area. I also have a teaching role, and I'm still studying and teaching. And on the end of all that, I'm running and building and developing my own clinic. So it's quite a few hats that I'm juggling at the moment.
Yeah, do you ever get out?
Have a social life?
Yeah, it's busy, isn't it?
I mean, I'm hoping we're getting a beer after this. That's my social life for the week. It's no, I love what I do. I really do. It's a passion of mine. And it spurs me on constantly to kind of keep learning and developing. But my wife does keep saying you should get a hobby.
Yeah, and I guess you're one of the lucky people where your work is your hobby. You love it enough for it to be the case.
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, for years, my wife has been saying I joke about getting a hobby. Last summer, I got my skydiving license. And now she's like, focus on your career. Stop doing stupid sports. So, but I've always loved what I do and found the human body in latter years, the psychology of pain, fascinating. So it spurs me on to keep studying and doing what I do.
And I think what's sometimes tricky is in when people are trying to understand health or their body or injuries, they get really focused in on the thing that's causing their problem.
Sure.
But actually what we understand now is that you have to understand the whole human body, the whole body, the mind, the way they all integrate in order to be an effective clinician or in order to effectively optimize your health. You have to have this real 360 view of all of that. And I when I hear you talk about your journey, as so much of it rings true to my journey as well, the volunteering in sport, doing lots of different types of clinical practice, starting with a specialism in one, moving over to another, having my own company now. So there's a lot of things that remind me of your journey, and some of it he was inspired by. So some of the pain stuff that you were talking about, it was at the time when I was starting to get really interested in that too. And when I watched a couple of your sessions, it really inspired me to learn a bit more about it. So one of the reasons I brought you on was because of that diversity and because of that range of skills that you've developed to show that there are other ways of becoming an effective practitioner, an effective clinician, whatever you want to call it, an effective coach. You can do it via specialism, or you can do it via range. And I think you're a perfect example of someone who's done it by range.
I quite like to view myself as a bit of a hybrid clinician, and I'm sure that a lot of therapists nowadays have that. We've taken a lot of different skill sets from other professions and studied under lots of people, and certainly a lot of the time I spent working with you, watching your rehab, really helped to develop my own skill set and approach to working with patients on a day-to-day basis. And it's great that I think in a way lots of clinicians are now becoming that kind of hybrid approach.
Yeah, and that's where the lines become blurred between what an osteopath is, what a physiotherapist is, what a chiropractor is. One of your friends, Jonathan Cairns, came on and spoke about that in a bit of detail as well.
Nice. And that's a good podcast.
Yeah, but similar to this, like you're the most physio-y osteopath I've ever worked with. And really all that means is when I watch you do similar things to physios, but actually you're still trained as an osteopath and your hands are still very osteopathic, right?
Yeah, I still integrate a lot of traditional osteopathy into my practice. I still enjoy doing a lot of manual therapy, hands-on massage, spinal manipulation. And I love the diversity of clinical practice, but I still do a lot of trackside, for instance. I really enjoy working with coaches, and one of the coaches I work most closely with is a guy called Coach Michael Afalaka, and we spend a lot of time at Lee Valley analysing the sprinters from a biomechanical perspective, but relaying that back to their past medical history. Why are they running like that? The coach might ask me, and it might stem back from a motor pattern that stems from like an Achilles tendon issue that hopefully we've then picked up or analysed, and it spurs on further kind of sports medicine investigations and things. It's great to have all those different approaches and to tap into them when you need to.
And the interesting part of what you're saying there is actually because for most people, their body will have an ability to adapt and compensate away from a previous medical injury, some kind of injury or problem. And that means that a lot of the time we probably don't need to intervene quite as much as maybe some people think. Your body will probably figure it out itself. For the general population, for someone who's maybe not pushing to be an elite sprinter or a marathon runner perhaps. But then for some people who are pushing their body maybe a bit further than they usually push their body,
Yeah.
sometimes those smaller things that we might notice in clinical practice do become relevant.
Yeah.
So when someone comes in and we're assessing, you're looking not necessarily at, this is for the general population, you're not necessarily looking for absolutely every small minutiae of deficiency perhaps.
Yeah.
You're more looking for big glaringly obvious things that would account for some form of dysfunction.
Yeah.
But actually in the elite world, you are looking for the minutiae.
Absolutely.
That's the difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
It matters.
Yeah, I suppose when I get a regular patient that comes to me, I tend to try and work out, well, first of all, they're presenting, let's say, with knee pain. And I tend to ask myself 3 questions. How much load are they subjecting that area to, that area of the body to? How capable are they of withstanding that load, and how capable are they of recovering from it? And so, with an elite athlete, you're really trying to home in on all those different areas. But sometimes you'll just be discussing with a patient and you might discover that they're actually breaking down because you said about how much load or how much training they're doing, but how effectively are they recovering as well? Are they sleeping well? They've got sensible nutrition, and so many other areas will feed into that too, like their, how stressed are they at the moment? Maybe that's the reason. And not only does that help you buy in to what makes them come to see you in the first place, why are they running? And that's one of the things that I've kind of merged my pain science understanding as well into my clinical practice and even to the sports world. If you're seeing a patient that has got knee pain and they can't run and they're incredibly stressed about that, maybe they run just for the endorphins, maybe they're running because they see their friends and they're going to lose their social side of their of that kind of sport, or maybe they're running to lose weight and they're really worried about that. So you can really merge the different areas of pain science, the kind of biomedical approach, and then the biopsychosocial element of the stress, the lifestyle factors, their perception of what's going on in their body and what they're scared about.
It makes you a really well-rounded clinician and coach, doesn't it? When you've got all these different strings to your bow, you can lean on different ones in different situations and try and bring them into what you're trying to do for that person in front of you. It probably allows you to be quite broad because you've had that broad learning style, right?
It does, but also not shy in pulling in the skill set of colleagues that are specialised in certain fields as well. Like I said, I'm very fortunate to work with a number of amazing clinicians that do have specialism in certain areas, and we will work as a team quite often. If I think they need some very advanced strength and conditioning or they need motivating, I'll send to my RS&C colleague. If they need a better programming and planning for a marathon, I might go down this area. So it's nice to work as a team. But for me as a clinician, I've been doing this for quite a while now, it's really nice to sit back, and one of the most important things is that initial consultation with the patient. And I pretty much fail now to have that initial discussion in less than half an hour, because I think it's so important to just sit back and just listen to their story without instantly going, well, my knee hurts, okay, let's have a quick examination of it, it's your fat pad or something like that. It's so important to get that overall picture of them as a being.
Tell us why, because you're preaching to the converted with me, but actually for some people that might sound quite confusing, because they might be in and out of a doctor's appointment in 10 minutes, they might be in and out of a consultant's appointment in 15 minutes perhaps.
Sure.
So they're really quite trying to get down to the, right, where's your pain, what's your problem, does it hurt there, prod, put you in a scanner, look, there's a thing on a scan. So why is it important as a non-doctor, let's say, that you spend more time talking?
Yeah, well, I guess the case history not only helps guide our examination, because we're listening for specific signs and symptoms of conditions that might help us to work out our hypothesis of what the problem is that's going forward. It also helps us to understand, what are your goals as a patient, because it might simply be just get out of pain and that's it. And you've given me the list of it's to walk up the stairs pain-free, or to play football with your kid or something like that. But also it helps us to understand, why you're coming to talk to us about this. Are you wanting us to go along that journey with you? And if it is just simply pain, then fine. There's lots of ways you can modulate pain and help to calm things down. But if you've got a big task or a goal, like one of my patients at the moment is aiming to climb Kilimanjaro and has a really bad knee issue that needs to help condition to that specific task. But from a biopsychosocial model perspective, understanding the patient's concern is really important. One of the questions that I really value when you're talking to a patient, and it doesn't always go down well, is to ask the patient, what do they actually think the problem is?
Yeah.
And I've played around with this an awful lot in the past, and it's interesting to see the patient's response to that question. And I phrase it differently depending on how I've been talking with them in the first instance. I might sometimes soften a little bit by saying, based on what you've told me, I think I already know what's going on and will assess it and confirm it or deny it in a moment. Yeah. But at this point, I'm just curious to find out, what do you think's going on? And I pause, and sometimes you get that little look from them like, well, you're supposed to tell me, right? Yeah. And I might even, if it looks like that's going to happen, I might even make that joke. Well, I know you're coming to see me to tell you. And I might then soften it a bit by saying, I'm just curious if you Googled any bits, or as a clinician, you said you just seen if they said anything that particularly resonates.
Yeah. So I asked this question this morning to one of my clients, and
how'd it go?
Yeah, it went really well, and I think it's one of the more powerful answers I've had, and one of the more effective uses of that question.
Sure.
Because he'd seen a number of people for various different injuries. He's had a fairly long injury history, and he actually said, no one is. It seems like everyone just kind of has their own answer as to why I'm having these problems.
How frustrating.
Yeah, and you could tell he was frustrated. And he said, no one has ever really given me anything that I really believe. But I think, and he's almost like he wanted me to ask the question. He said, I think that I've got these imbalances where my body is sort of adapted or compensated, but not really done it very well. Yeah. And I feel like my body is just slightly off. And there was nothing hugely scientific, but it was enough in there. And I said, I think your intuition is probably where we'd go to as a solution, because the thing you've told me so far, it sounds a bit like that. You've had all these different injuries in different places, but you've never had any kind of structured rehab plan from it. You've just got back to doing the thing. And as a result of that, your body will just compensate and find a way around it. Yeah. So as a result, you may have picked up some bad habits. You may have picked up some quirky movement patterns and some weaknesses here and there. Yeah. And he was like, that actually sounds what it feels like. And so, obviously we've got an examination, we've got to test the theory, and off we went. But it was a really effective one, because I think sometimes patients do have a pretty good intuition about their own body. Sure. Not always, but sometimes. And it's those ones that do have it that you want to really lean on and find out more information.
And it's such a great way to build rapport with a person, to help them to understand that you've listened and you get them as an individual, because you've got to get that kind of patient sort of relationship in the right sort of way. But that's brilliant. And that question, what do you think's going on? It opens up so many different areas for the patient to take that. But I often then follow it up with, what do you think you need to do to help this get better?
Yeah.
And sounds like they already started to lead down that road, and you might not need to ask it. But at that point, it's interesting, particularly as an osteopath, I typically get the usual sort of, it needs a good rub and a click like the other guy used to do before I came here. Yeah. And that's fine, and for me it's often important to acknowledge that's what they perceive and what they value as the therapy. But sometimes patients might even they've got back pain, they come to an osteopath, but they might say, I think my core's weak, or I've just got to get stronger, or I just want you to show me some stretches to help manage this myself. And I'm going to direct that therapy quite differently in that next stage of the assessment. It might not be the approach that I deemed to take, and I might then discuss that with them and give them options, but it's a really good insight into them and their individual. And then obviously then move on to the assessment, the examination, which will be a combination of movement assessments, orthopedic tests, but that plus the case history then gives me a better understanding of what the likely diagnosis of their problem is. And then we might call upon MRI scans or other investigations, or see our doctor if other tests do need to be done. But for me, the value of that initial discussion is really important. You get the occasional patient that's itching to get on the couch and they're half undressed before you've even asked them their name. But fortunately, most people actually value that time to explain their story to them, because I'm very fortunate. I often see patients that have been elsewhere that have other interventions in the past, and I quite like to try and work out, what approach have other people done, and where's that hurdle? What is it that hasn't helped them get there?
It's information as well, isn't it? There's no point in you just doing the same thing that someone else has done that didn't work. So it makes our job easier, I think, when they have ended up seeing other people, because you're shortcutting the clinical reasoning process. You can say, that didn't work, so I'm not going to repeat that unless they didn't do it very well. Sure. So you can almost make it easier by listening into what's not worked.
True.
And there's there's sometimes when you ask that, well, what do you think it is? When they say something, you think, no, it's definitely not that. Yeah. But in a way, it can help you to go, well, I can help you narrow that down just because that doesn't sound quite what I think it might be. Sure. Let's go through some examination. So yeah, I think it is such a powerful question. Sometimes you get the right answer. Sometimes you get one really left field that doesn't sound right at all.
Sure. I mean, the other day I had a new patient, and he did quite a classic osteopathy sort of answer, which was, I think I've got a leg length discrepancy, my pelvis is out. Yeah. And I listened to your podcast with John Cairns, and he talked about that quite a bit. And I did briefly think, okay, we've got a classic osteopathic patient here. He's been led down that road, assessed him 1.25 inches of leg length discrepancy. Like, oh wow, no, you're spot on. But yeah, sometimes you're looking for those sort of yellow flags as such, those sort of other areas you might want to explore in your therapy going forward.
Yeah, and once you've had that long consultation, that long conversation with them, where does it then go from there? So you're then doing your examination, and sure. What's your style from that point onwards?
It has changed over the years. Like at the start, we talked about how I would have almost two polar opposite clinical practices where I'd have your runners, and I'd be doing in-depth predominantly biomechanical assessments, and the other one was more pain science. I guess I've integrated them all now much more effectively, and I've softened my pain science approach quite a lot. When we were working together, I used to spend quite a long time explaining pain to patients. As I was taught to do, I draw diagrams of how the brain interprets this concept of pain and things, how there aren't pain nerves in the body, is nociceptors, danger nerves, etc. Now I integrate pain science more into my regular patient's experience, and it might just be something as simple as reassurance. And I do find that reassurance can be a very powerful thing, helping them to understand that pain doesn't necessarily mean damage, and things like that can just really help to change their belief about their problem. So I guess I've integrated this, and it's patient specific. Like I'll still have my sprinters, and I'll be doing lots of strength testing, and that's an area of my clinical practice at the moment that I'm developing and really getting excited about. But there's still a psychological element to track athletes and the likes.
There's a pretty famous pain physio, Louis Gifford, who
read all his books. He was amazing.
Yeah, reassurance is a bloody good painkiller was one of his most famous quotes. So
absolutely,
I think it's so true that provided we do it well, and provided we take the time to listen, which is what you've just explained, to examine closely and go through all the important assessment techniques and make sure we rule out the scary stuff, we're in a pretty good place to be able to confidently reassure someone. Yep. Some of that reassurance, I think, comes from being able to map out a plan for them as well. Sure. We might not be able to guarantee any specific outcome at a certain period of time, but we can certainly give them a plan and say it's quite likely you're going to get better with this solution or that solution. And I think that plan can be quite reassuring as well. Sure. And I've certainly had people who leave the room and say, oh, I feel hopeful. Even if I've sat on the fence with a diagnosis, perhaps I've said, I'm not fully sure yet, this is what we're going to try and do. Sure. They feel hope at the end of that, just because we've managed to map out a plan. I think that's quite an important thing of what we do.
And listen, understood their problem, and taken the time to carefully assess their body and reassure any concerns they do have, and like you say, come up with a plan. Is that where your coaching comes into it as well, Charlie?
I think so. I think that, I've certainly rebranded myself as a physio coach these days.
I saw that. That's awesome.
Yeah, I just see that what we do, it leans more into coaching than it does therapy, and it doesn't mean that we go away from some of the therapy modalities, things like hands-on techniques. I still use them where necessary, but I think most of my success now comes through more of a coaching principle and motivating people towards behavior change, those kind of things, and listening to people and helping them find their own answers to solutions, and that's very much a coaching strategy. So I probably identify more with the coaching definition than I do the therapist definition nowadays.
That's cool.
Which is ironic, given that we're in a room that looks like we could be therapists ourselves.
I need to lie down on this couch.
It's the chaise lounge.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I want to go a little bit more into some of the clinical evolution you're talking about, and the profiling that you're doing with some of your athletes, because I think that's a really interesting part of where you're going, and we're certainly doing that a little bit with some of our services as well, of profiling people, using numbers. If you're not testing, you're guessing. And I think the pendulum could definitely swing too far, and I think we could get carried away with numbers. True. So I want to hear where you're going with that, and maybe we could flesh out a bit of that pendulum.
So When I was at UCL, I did my postgrad research in athlete profiling. It was around a time when I was very biomechanical focused, and I did a prospective assessment of functional movement screen. It was around the time FMS was very popular, and I was intrigued by this concept of getting an athlete to do certain movements and grading that quality of movement in the hope that you'd identify faulty movement mechanics or restrictions and things that might potentially lead to injury. I did a literature review of the FMS and moved slightly away from that. But
because?
Well, let's be careful here. Yeah, it's interesting as a concept. The literature that I read at the time wasn't very persuasive to me.
That was my understanding too.
And I'm glad I did that literature review, because I know a lot of clinics that adopt the FMS and use it as a very kind of blind tool to just look at, you move well, you move badly, this must mean you're more susceptible to injury. It's not as clear cut as that.
Yeah, and that's because of there's a multitude of factors that influence injury, right?
Yeah, it's so hard to identify who's going to get injured as an athlete. There are so many factors that come into play when taking speed, sprinting. Why do some athletes pull a hamstring? Obviously, most people will consider strength deficits as one of the key things, and it's an absolutely big factor, but there's so many other areas that feed into that. And as part of my postgrad research, it was around the time Lee Harrington released the QASLS, which is a 10-point grading criteria of single leg tasks, single leg squats, single leg drop landings, things like that. And I used that tool and many others at Brentford Football Club and a Sevenoaks Hockey Club, and I was very fortunate to have access to quite a decent cohort of athletes. I was advised to just home in, as is the best way with research, to the QASLS, but that study really got me interested in trying to identify athletes at risk of injury. And when I then started working in London with you, when I became a running coach, I started incorporating that into squat assessments and movement analysis. Over time, I've become very interested in initially profiling running athletes, endurance testing, things like that. And then as I've transitioned more to speed athletes, the need for better strength assessments and power output and things like that led me down the path of force plates and more objective data capturing, like handheld dynamometry. And that's when you and I had that discussion. Was it like 3-4 years ago?
I think it was COVID, because I remember being in my garden. I actually remember having the conversation with you. Being in my garden, walking around
Beer
my
in
garden.
hand.
Maybe COVID probably was, there wasn't much else to do.
Yeah.
But I remember being in the garden, walking around, having this conversation with you, and you were weighing up what metrics to use and what tests to do, and I was talking you through some of the things I'd done in previous jobs in football. And then I don't know, a year or so later, I'm watching you in clinic doing it. I'm like, wow, I can see it. I can see how that conversation is now transpired into actual service.
I'm incredibly grateful for the insight you gave me at that time, and that was the nudge that I needed to move on to that next stage, where I kind of drew away a little bit from the functional movement assessments. I still incorporate that in some of my assessments, but at the moment, and the time of recording this, I've got to caveat it with I'm sure I'll be doing something different next year. And it's great to look back at in the last 4 years now, I've been seriously assessing speed athletes, and it has evolved over that time from more endurance testing, McGill trunk endurance test, back extensions, V-sits, side plank sort of endurance testing, squat assessments, jump landings and things like that. It gradually evolved to handheld dynamometry, adductor sort of ratios, hamstring quad ratios, things like that, to then integration of the force plates. And that was when I really, another light bulb moment. And it's around the time I started studying postgrad S&C as well. And just being able to get some objective data is invaluable. And the way I try to do things at the moment is, I guess there's 4 prongs to the assessment. One is a past medical history and an osteopathic assessment, which ranges from big toe extension, ankle dorsiflexion range, all the way to thoracic rotation and extension. The second is some sort of strength profile. What is their strength capacity of the athlete? Then it's more kind of power metrics, classic jumps, counter movement jumps. What's their peak power that this athlete can generate? And then some reactivity testing to try and work out how efficient is that their elastic sort of
How
stiffness
springy they are,
qualities and
how
things.
springy they can be through their tendons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And from that, you can then capture a decent chunk of data, which then you can correlate to their past medical history, any limitations the coach might perceive in their performance. And then with certain athletes, I'll then spend time with them trackside, watching and analysing their biomechanics, and then tie that back to, okay, they've had a history of Achilles tendinopathy, they've lost ankle stiffness when they're sprinting, and they don't actively dorsiflex before they hit the ground, and the coach thinks they're spending too long on the ground. And we've done some endurance tests of their calf, we've done some maximal strength tests of their calf, maybe even a rate of force development test, and we've identified their deficits in these different areas, and it better guides their strength and conditioning interventions, or might feed back to other parts of the medical team that they might want to work on more mobility side of things, or perhaps they need a bit of hands-on therapy, or they're not doing their recovery well enough. And because we work very closely with all the athletes, we get other data as well, like how their sleep is and things like that. So it's great to kind of, you get this wealth of information, and you spend hours analysing it as well.
And I've definitely come across situations where data is captured for data's sake.
Sure.
It sounds like you've tried to really narrow down on the stuff that you're going to use. And what you've just said there is the application of lots of different types of data in different areas that all comes into one clinical decision or one coaching decision. It sounds the optimal use of that data. Now, my argument is that when that data is captured just for the sake of it, you end up wasting people's time. You end up not really knowing what you're taking it for, and then people start to distrust the whole process of testing and what's the point in all this stuff again? Or what did we do with this stuff last time? And I absolutely agree with them. So that's where I'm really trying to think in my own clinical hat as well. It's like, what are we doing this test for? Even in the session, what's this test? Am I going to use the data or not?
True. Yeah, sometimes it's good to build over time that normative data though. So it is really helpful, and we're very fortunate to have a wealth of information now on normative sprinters from different sort of capabilities, from Olympic athletes all the way down to developmental ones. And it's great to be able to get an idea now of, what is a peak power that we might expect to see in an athlete.
Tell me. Is that public information?
It certainly can be.
Ballpark figure. What does an elite sprinter have?
So one of our lads that's 10.02 seconds is about 74 watts per kilogram for peak power from a counter movement jump. Yeah, that's incredible. And
what are you?
Oh Christ, like 10? No, I'm joking. I couldn't tell you. Nowhere near that.
Yeah, and what
40, 50?
Yeah, I think I'm about the same. Yeah, and what about and maybe a slightly less able? So what's the difference between right at the top and someone who's just not quite there?
I would have to whip out my laptop and talk you through some of those areas. We're very fortunate with the data range that we do have, and you can subcategorize around that. Yeah. And the company that we use for the force plays do have some normative data as well for different age ranges, which is always good to correlate to. It's not ideal because you don't know what their protocol is. So things like cueing a sprinter, I might cue differently to say a jumping to a footballer, for instance. So you don't know what their assessment protocol was. So it's hard to look at normative data from other places and say that's going to, okay, you're only in the top 20 percentile or something like that. But the data range is quite a lot depending on what that kind of athlete is. But if you've got your own protocols and your own assessment method for doing that, and your own warm up and prep and similar time of the day, then you can use that to work out, not only monitor the athlete through that season, hopefully identify any deficits that they do have that you might then intervene on.
So we took a very short break to resolve a small technical issue. For some reason, our mics keep cutting out. But what it's done is it's allowed Pete an opportunity to whip his laptop out and pull up some of that data, because I think that's quite interesting, is what data really marks out a super elite performer, someone who's right at the top of their game. So you've got some data there to give us some numbers, and you've actually already said that actually the number you said wasn't as high as it actually is. So go on, Pete, over to you. What is an elite sprinter when it comes to metrics?
Well, there are so many ways to assess an athlete, but if we just focus on one of the most widely used assessments is a counter movement jump. Hands on hips, jump as high as you can. It's essentially measuring the amount, how rapidly and how much force they can generate from a rapid hip extension, which carries over, should I say, to the track very nicely. And I'm just looking at the data range of the athletes that I've assessed just this pre-season, because as we record this, it's the early part of this season. It's Olympic year next year, so obviously we're starting early and pushing really hard. So I've done a lot of profiling this season. One of my sprinters that's world class, his peak power that I assessed a couple of weeks ago was 80.4 watts per kilogram, which is exceptional. And typically from my cohort of sprinters I've worked with, ranging from up and coming, very talented athletes to world class, and some of them are Olympic quality. From this data I'm just quickly looking at just for this year, it ranges in males from 59 watts per kilogram all the way up to 80. And that does tend to correlate very clearly with their athletic performance. And as a metric, that's one of the key things that we look at. Female sprinters, and jump height, that ranges an awful lot as well. So the average kind of jump height for this cohort just this pre-season was 49 centimetres, and the highest was 58.97 centimetres.
Massive, yes.
That guy can jump, and he is one of the quicker athletes, not the quickest, but he's incredible. Female sprinters averages around 56 watts per kilogram, and the highest was kind of mid-60s. And then the highest jump height I've recorded this pre-season was 45 centimetres, which is incredibly good. But that athlete sprints, but is also an Olympic jumper as well, triple jumper. So you've got a really a large breadth of different ranges there.
Yeah, and this is what we were talking about: is have you got data that can really be used and applied into a performance world? Does this actually? Well, that's the famous saying is, does it make the boat go faster? I think that's from rowing, isn't it? So that's the key. It's like you've really got to be able to trust that you're taking data that's relevant and making decisions that are relevant for performance.
Yeah, and understanding their individual strength qualities. That's one of the things that's really incredible when you're working with this cohort of athletes. At the end of the day, not many sports get as pure as the 100-meter sprint. And you'd expect that, certainly the ones that are at that certain level have bodies that are so unique and they've adapted, or they're just lucky in their genetics that's the sport they're incredibly good at. But there's so much difference even in the 100-meter sprinters. One of the things we assess is ankle dorsiflexion range of motion. That's the amount that the ankle will bend. And from the sort of running endurance world, you'd typically be looking for like 40 degrees bent knee ankle dorsiflexion or more. Was it Richard Willey that identified like plus 40 degrees is the best, is sort of that kind of cutoff? Then when I started looking into sprinters and footballers, you were lucky if you hit mid-30s. Like stiffer ankles tend to be very common in sprinters. And some have suggested that's actually an advantage for the sport. And I can understand the mechanisms of that. The other day I had a sprinter, first time I met them, that I'm working with a new coach at the moment, and he brought his squad of 12 down to our clinic, and myself and two of our colleagues did a whole profiling in that one day. And this one athlete really stood out because his bent knee ankle dorsiflexion was about 58 degrees. It's like the guy didn't have an anterior ankle. His toes just wanted to go all the way up to his shins. Yeah. And I flagged this to the coach, and we had a discussion about it. And sometimes you might expect to see that athlete might lack stiffness qualities. They might drop into excessive dorsiflexion. I just inquired to the coach, do you ever see this correlate to the track? And he was, it was ecstatic to see that, because he then said that finally makes sense, because I'm forever telling him, get off the ground, stop being so slow, make that next step really quickly. And when we looked at his single leg hop test, we can measure stiffness on that and efficiency of that sort of elastic elements, how efficient is the calf and the Achilles tendon of storing that elastic energy, but also propelling. And he scored quite badly on that. So that might then direct me for that athlete to focus more on, we're not going to stiffen that ankle up. That's just how he is genetically. But can we improve his reactivity and his stiffness qualities so he's not having to access that extreme range of motion when he's sprinting? So we're looking at loads more plyometrics beyond the usual sort of track drills that they do, a lot of sprinters do. He hasn't focused much on plyometrics. That's something that he's going to start working on, and high force isometrics to try and promote more rigidity and stiffness around the ankle, or at least be more efficient at recruiting those muscles in that position.
Yeah.
I might be very different to a really stiff ankle. Maybe we'll work more on mobility, or maybe there's a calf deficit, or it can really steer you down multiple different paths. The idea is to try and work out what that individual needs to work on.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and that's something we can even rely on in clinical practice. Is don't just get your off-the-shelf program out for someone because it mostly works. What's going to be needed for this individual in front of you? And that's where the world of profiling and testing can really help the clinical practice. It can really help the day-to-day weekend warrior, the person, maybe not even that, just how do you use that learning where you're pushing the boundaries for performance reasons? How does that actually materialize into the clinical world? And I think it does when used properly, when you're really individualizing care, bespoking care to the person in front of you. It's relevant.
Sure.
And one of the things that really interests me for that guy there's two things. So firstly, he must be unbelievably well compensated to still be a complete outlier on his ankle flexibility, and yet still be probably running some pretty seriously quick times.
Sure.
Yeah, he must be unbelievably powerful in like quads, glutes and hamstrings, right?
Yeah, no, he was. I mean, and I'm just starting to get to grips with his unique body, but he is a very mobile athlete. He had a lot of hip extension, much greater than the average, but a lot of muscular strength proximally, and that's one of the things you identify often with, and it has been shown in the literature that having large gluteus maximus, big strong butt basically, is one of the is almost a predictor of strength. And sprinting fundamentally is about how much hip extension force can you generate as quick as you can.
Yeah, and I guess what you were saying about the ankle is if you can generate that force through a nice stiff foot, which is then generated by ankle stiffness and Achilles tension, then you can propel it through the floor. Whereas if you've got too much softness through that area, not enough stiffness, a bit loose, then you lose some of that energy. So as that foot hits the floor, it then loses some of that power, and they're losing some of that energy, right? So that's
where the sports medicine, sports science side comes into it, because you might then try and work out, well, why is it they're dropping into that position so much? Is it like the story I just said about the athlete has almost excessive mobility in that region? Are they adopting an old motor pattern because they've had a history of injury there, the Achilles tendinopathy or some other kind of injuries in the past? Or is it just a technical fault?
And I love this conversation because I think most people would think that more mobility is better as a rule. And sometimes that's true, but actually there's loads of people where they don't need more, they need less. They maybe need strength within that mobility to protect those extremes of range, because it might be those extremes that are causing the problems. And for performance, sometimes you do want to be really strong in mid-range and you don't really need the rest of it. It's kind of irrelevant for performance.
You'll be leaking time if you're going to be trying to access that full range. I mean, ground contact time at max velocity sprinting is about 0.1 seconds. Last season, we formally assessed that, and a lot of our guys are even quicker than that. And you're talking about minute times there. And you don't have you just basically got to generate as much vertical impulse at max velocity as quickly as you can, and that's the biggest predictor of the elites versus the amateurs.
I think there's another one as well where elite sprinters are anteriorly tilted through their pelvis because it's an anatomical advantage. The amount of people I've had come in to see me and say, "Oh, I've been told I've got anterior pelvic tilt," almost as if they're letting me know they've got cancer. It's like, this isn't a problem for you. Don't worry. Like, this is just your anatomical makeup.
Sure.
You might have some symptoms because you don't have enough strength perhaps in certain areas, or you just spend too much time in the wrong postures, but don't worry about your anterior tilt. It might actually turn you into a sprinter one day.
That's nice. Again, we're circling back to our pain science side of things, and the reassurance is a painkiller from your Louis Gifford.
Exactly.
I had another well-accomplished sprinter not long ago that was really worried about his scoliosis, and I he actually didn't know. He was one of the few that didn't know that Usain Bolt was famous for having a big scoliosis. And to be able to say, well, that makes you has more in common with him. Well, how nice was that? Suddenly,
it's such a powerful thing.
It. Sure.
My second point, I've just remembered, I didn't go back to my second point about your guy that you've identified as having the flexible ankles, is you've got this strategy now that you're ready to put in place. What I think will be fascinating now is seeing the results of that strategy. You've used data to identify a potential performance limiter. Now you've got a strategy, and it's great to see whether his performance improves beyond what you'd normally expect in a normal season, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, hopefully we can get his ground contact time down. He can generate more force with a stiffer ankle and stop leaking time. That's the aim. I hope it can correlate. Obviously, what you do in the gym doesn't always correlate to the track. That's where you need a good coach. But if you can have the essential strength qualities, and in the gym you can do enough exercises that might correlate to the athletic performance, then hopefully you're on to a winner. Yeah,
I find this, I'm going to take a slight detour here and talk about long-term knee rehab. I do a lot of ACL rehab with clients, and what I tend to find is that just because they've got really strong in that middle phase of their rehab doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be able to jump. In fact, it almost guarantees they're not, because they've spent so long not jumping, not hopping. You've got to learn and teach them how to jump, how to hop, how to use the strength they've obtained, and how to turn it into power, how to turn it into reactivity,
how to trust that limb they've been avoiding loading for so long.
So that's kind of what you're saying there. Even right at the top end, just because they're super strong through glutes, hamstrings, quads, doesn't mean they know how to apply that strength into speed. Correct. And that's the coaching, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So then once you've got someone who's knows their profile, knows what they're doing, if they get injured, is there like a pattern that you're finding that the ones who get injured have got deficits, or have you found any relation to that? Because I know it's pretty murky in the world of sports medicine around strength profiling and injuries.
And part of this is where the benefits of the athlete profiling comes in, that you've got some normative data. So not only does it help you, obviously the aim is to help their athletic performance first and foremost, and hopefully reduce any risk of injury. One athlete I assessed the other day had a hamstring injury. First time I met him back in June, he thought he'd recovered from well enough, but a lot of our max force testing around the hip and the hamstring still identified somewhat of a deficit, and adductors were also down, so that then will steer me to kind of work on rehabbing and further development on that side. But you said earlier about how sometimes you just capture data for data's sake. At times though, that's not a bad thing. So I still do, with a lot of my athlete assessments, some standard orthopedic tests, the usual sort of clinical assessment. Even though they're not currently in pain, it's good to understand, if you'll be working with that athlete for a while, what their norm is. Give you a quick example. One of my athletes unfortunately had a hamstring strain when I first started working with him, and another physio that was very predominant around the time of working with the group when I was new to this one group, sent for an MRI, found he had a hamstring strain, started off down the path. When I assessed him, I was fortunate that not long before that I just got to meet him and did spinal assessments, orthopedic testing at the back, and looked at other kind of strength assessments, and I was very worried to see that now he had symptoms from his lumbar spine that is beyond that athlete's norm. So because I had that understanding from the start, it helped me to flag up, okay, maybe we should look at your lumbar spine a bit closer. Turned out he had a bone stress injury in his lumbar spine, and that's possibly what had led to the hamstring being the final culprit as such. So often it's useful having a wealth of data and an understanding of what their norm is, that if they do get injured, you can look back and say, well, okay, you're typically around this kind of ballpark.
And when you're getting like real clear and obvious differences left side to right side, do you try and create symmetry?
For sprinting, max velocity, I'm quite happy to get them fairly symmetrical. Obviously the start isn't symmetrical. You do generate more hip extension propulsion at the drive out phase from the leg that's in the front of the blocks, because that has a lot more time pushing out of the blocks. So the start, the acceleration phase, is slightly asymmetrical, but for max velocity upright sprinting, I tend to expect more symmetry there.
What about in clinical practice? What's your thoughts around symmetry there?
We're all asymmetrical animals. We're all different in our own unique, interesting ways. In a strange way, working with athletics has made me more osteopathic, because I strongly believe that the small details, the assessments that we do traditionally taught as osteopaths, looking at the pelvis, the anterior tilt, as you alluded to, the spinal, lines and curves and all this sort of stuff. I will be very diagnostic and very focused on a sprinter, whereas with someone that's got back pain from doing DIY or moving a house, I'm much more relaxed about that sort of thing. And pain is an incredibly complex thing, of course, as we've already talked about. But a lot of the time I'm trying to de-threaten, is that a word I think Louis Gifford used to use? I'm trying to de-threaten patients' perception of that area.
Yeah, and I think that is the key difference here, and that's, we alluded to it earlier as well, actually, that in performance sport, it does matter. Those small little details are sometimes really important for their performance, but actually in the everyday person, sometimes the small details can cause negative problems. They can sometimes start hyper-focusing on the wrong thing.
Athletes too, though. Your story about the anterior pelvic tilt, was that a sprinter? Or?
I've heard it a few times. Because that's not necessarily from... Yeah,
of course. But one of our athletes, he is quite a classic sprinter in that posture. Anterior pelvic tilt, short hip flexors, that side of things. And we do time to time get an opinion from an external specialist, and we will really leave no stone unturned to try and help these guys. So if they've got we might get a foot specialist involved, for example. And last season, one of the external therapists did get into the athlete's mind about this anterior pelvic tilt. And you can see he's developing a bit of a habit where he rocks his pelvis and tries to set his pelvis normally before he comes out the block. And my track colleagues and I have had that discussion of, well, is that okay? Should we let him? That's a strategy that's almost like his warm-up. It makes him feel safe. He kind of does a weird wiggle in the blocks before he goes. Or should we try and correct that and de-threaten it? Say, don't worry, look, your pelvis is absolutely fine. And it's sometimes you have that.
So really what we're finishing on is that it depends.
For sure.
Always. I feel like we always end up landing on this, but in a good way. That's what the podcast format allows us to do, is to have conversations about the grey, not try and be too binary about anything, just to have this long conversation about where we might go for one person but probably go a different way in another person. And yes, elite sport is different because performance is one of the primary outcomes, and in the general public it's not. It's more about health and well-being and happiness, satisfaction, and not suffering, all those things. And acknowledging that actually in that world we're not trying to perfect anything because you're focusing on the wrong thing. You're just trying to be functional and not suffer.
Yeah.
But there's still bits of the elite world that you're taking into your everyday population that probably means they get better care from you.
Yeah, and even if it is just assessing that patient with an Achilles issue, you can take some of those tests that you've perfected in the elite world and apply that to the patient. You won't do the full profiling that you would do for an elite athlete, but there are little nuggets that you can take from it that'll really help someone. And that's why I have worked so hard in the athletic world, and I've been inspired by so many great clinicians that have different approaches, that it's great to kind of take some of those qualities.
And that's what this podcast is all about, having conversation with lots of different interesting people about different ways of working and helping me really in to try and be a better clinician, but also helping the listeners to optimize their own health. And this podcast is called Better Never Ends. What does that mean to you, Pete, in your world?
Well, it means an incredible clinic that you've developed, Charlie.
Well, you don't need to be kind. You can.
I know it's brilliant to be here today and to look around and see what a great place that you've built. And to me, I think that encompasses everything that you value. And I really like the physio coach side of things. Yeah. And that's such a great phrase that hopefully a lot of patients will take and instill in them the confidence to keep on developing and growing themselves as an individual, but also not to let small hurdles, small blips in their pain experience stop them from reaching their goal or what they value.
Now, Pete, speaking of hurdles, I feel like I need to mention your clinic, and you've done an amazing job in doing your own clinic, and I don't want it to be too self-congratulatory and be too nicey here, but you actually had a pretty big hurdle to deal with yourself fairly early on. Just to finish up, maybe talk to us a little bit about what that's like as a business owner.
Well, this is a therapy couch, right? No, it's been quite the journey, and having worked at numerous other clinics and developing myself, I've always wanted to create an environment that I loved to work in and hope that others would enjoy coming to work at. And I chose the practice, the setting, because it meant a lot to me. It was home. It's a beautiful little village just outside London in Kent, and a very fortunate situation to be able to build an old bank and convert it into a clinic. And we built a rehab gym and put in it the force plates and all the advanced testing, and we opened in September 2019. A couple of my incredible athletes, Olympians, opened the premises, and we got off to a great start. And then 3-4 months later, lockdown happened, and that was a pretty stressful period. But it did help me to reflect and start to study and develop the business even further. We also had a few other minor hiccups, which I won't go into too much, but let's just say a certain waterboard flooded the building. We had to rebuild it for the second bloody time. So we had 2 big hurdles, but at least in our first year of business, we survived a plague and a flood, and we're still here. So we're quite resilient in that front. And I'm very fortunate that a lot of other specialists have come to join us, and it's a great place to work and to develop and to, I really enjoy seeing a wide cohort of patients, from your usual osteopathic ones with back pain, headaches and jaw problems, all the way to the elite athletes that we're fortunate to see on a regular basis down in Kent.
Yeah, it's a cool place. I did come and visit a year and a bit ago. Again. Yeah, so it's a really cool place. And I think what would be nice is, I'm not sure you have time, because we heard how busy you are, but what do you do to learn yourself? What's the things that you do? You're studying a lot at the moment, but what do you...
I do listen to a few podcasts. I've enjoyed listening to this one. I'm currently doing a postgrad qualification in strength and conditioning at St Mary's. I've always harboured ambitions to go ahead and do a PhD. I briefly dipped my toe in that water before I was fortunate to get the role at British Athletics. That really spurred me down that line, and I was building the practice whilst I was working down there. And I've continued to work with a number of the coaches down there still. But in my spare time, which is not much of it at the moment, I do as much studying as I can.
Amazing. You're quite inspirational, to be honest. Probably the studying part is where I haven't quite got the energy anymore. Sure. All the rest of it takes up my headspace. But what you're doing is really inspirational, and I'm glad that you've come on. Thanks so much for coming in.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and I've enjoyed this conversation.
Pete, if someone wants to find out a bit more about you or speak to you, send you a message, what would be the best way of doing that? Please
check us out on the usual socials, Acer House Practice. My own Instagram is... recently started, is called the Sprint Osteo, and or you can just check us out at acerhousepractice.co.uk.
Thanks so much, and I think we're off for a Christmas beer.
Let's do it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Better, provider of health, wellness and performance services based in central London. You can book in for face-to-face services at either of our 2 clinics, one in Soho and one in the city. You can also follow us on Instagram at Better Never Ends, or head over to our website for more information about the clinics or the podcast at www.betterneverends.com. And of course, if you want to send us an email with any feedback, questions or suggestions for future episodes, then email us on podcast@betterneverends.com. And finally, thanks to Brian Long for editing the show. Without him, it's absolutely no doubt in my mind that these would never have seen the light of day. And it will allow this podcast to continue on for as long as I'll keep recording them. So thanks very much, Brian.